Hello and welcome back to Real Crime Profile. This is Jim Clemente, retired FBI profiler and former New York City prosecutor, and currently writer and producer on CBS's hit series Criminal Minds, among other things. And with me today is...
Laura Richards. I'm a criminal behavioural analyst and founder and director of Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service.
And I'm Lisa Zambetti. I'm the casting director for Criminal Minds and Beyond Borders, and I have a real interest in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes and the people whose lives are changed by those crimes.
Well, today we have, once again, our guest, Bill Thomas, who is talking to us about the murder of his sister, Kathy Thomas, 30 years ago, and that crime still remains unsolved. How you doing, Bill?
I'm good, thank you, and thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here, and I know this is dredging up a lot of nasty details and information, but we really appreciate you being here to do that because we believe that by giving a voice to your sister and the other victims, that we will actually be making kind of a sea change in criminal law and how it's basically covered by the media. It's really important to us, to Laura and myself, and to Lisa, that we give the victims a voice. And in their victimology, they teach us, and hopefully we can help prevent crime because of that.
So, Bill, last time you were here, you mentioned that you and your family really stayed out of the media. You avoided the media when your sister was killed, but then something made you come back. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. In 2009, a story broke in media, specifically on television in the Norfolk area, that the FBI had lost control of about 80 highly graphic crime scene photos. And we were shocked by that. And at this point, it occurred to me that we needed to step in and begin speaking to the media directly. And we made the decision to begin engaging with the other Colonial Parkway murders families and with the media in general. Now, at this point, we had never talked to any of the other Colonial Parkway
This is
murder
2009.
victims. This is 2009,
Yeah.
fall 2009.
I just want to back up one real quick. So the significance of that story is that her murder photos were out there now. Is that?
Yeah, basically what you had was a PowerPoint presentation of approximately 80 highly graphic crime scene photos. And this would have been part of originally a slide presentation. Again, you have to go back to late 80s now.
For class.
Right. Well, this would have been presented to law enforcement by the FBI.
Right. And just to clarify, actually, it's not about losing control because the fact is there are hundreds of thousands of similar photographs being circulated around law enforcement circles. There's a huge conference going on right now down in Dallas, the Crimes Against Children conference, and there will be 2,000 or 3,000 law enforcement and related professionals down there, and there will be thousands of similar crime scene photos also shown at that conference, and it is necessary within law enforcement circles to actually do that. In this particular case, what happened was there was a FBI photographer who had retired and was using those photographs as training materials, but he passed away. And somebody had a copy of that. It wasn't the original photographs, and it certainly didn't. It wasn't released to the public. These were law enforcement training materials, and they are what we call law enforcement sensitive. They should certainly not be published. But for example, in cases like O.J. Simpson, I mean, her crime scene photos were published to the public, and that does absolutely violate the victim, their rights, and the family of the victim's rights. But I can understand the confusion at the time, certainly, and there was some confusion because they didn't know where these photos had come from. But as a career law enforcement officer, I'm telling you that there are hundreds of thousands of such pictures, and if we weren't, as law enforcement officers, able to use those photographs, it would be a terrible travesty of justice because then law enforcement agencies across the country and around the world would not gain the benefit of how you do actual criminal investigative analysis, how you do crime scene reconstruction, how you read a crime scene. They're educational tools for professionals, and they should only be in the professionals' hands. But that said, I totally understand, and unfortunately, I'm certain that all victims can't be notified whenever copies are made and they're used in law enforcement presentations. I'm sure you've used them yourself, Laura, right?
Yeah, I mean, of course, you do use things as learning aids or teaching aids, but normally, if I use a presentation or pictures of victims in particular, I do ask permission from their families. If I'm doing something, that's got sort of 200-300 other people sat there, but you can't do that in every case, as you said. But you have to just be very careful about who you share that material with. And
Absolutely.
I know lots of people do ask me for my slides after I've presented. And 100% of the time now I say no.
Right. I always, when people ask me for my PowerPoint presentations, I always prepare a second handout version that does not have the slides attached, because I am trying to maintain the law enforcement sensitive nature of those slides.
You can redact it. I mean, I've certainly had the situation where people post things online, in the past, and certainly, with my own data included. Which of course creates risk issues for you too. So I think now people are a lot more careful about these things. Certainly not everybody, but yeah, sometimes you can just do a redacted version. But yeah, you never know where people may end up showing something or using something.
Right.
So back to what you're saying, this was the first time that you'd actually spoken to other family members of the other victims, which I think is incredible.
Yeah, that's correct. We'd never spoken to any of the other Colonial Parkway murder victims' families, even the Dowski family. As I mentioned, we'd never met the Dowskis. We hadn't even met Becky at the time of her death. As I mentioned, we were supposed to meet at that Thanksgiving, which would have been a month or two later. So it did start me down a path of reaching out to the other Colonial Parkway murder victims' families. And it also is something without I'm not pushing back at all about what Jim and Laura just said about what's appropriate for law enforcement. But these were out in a way that, people had access to them, and it's an unsolved case.
I mean, 80 of them is quite a lot. We're not just talking about a couple. We're talking about a lot of pictures.
Right. And they were color in black and white, and they had been shot by FBI and Virginia State Police and other law enforcement photographers. But one of the things, it was very evident from watching, and I've done a fair amount of media coaching and training with executives and been a spokesperson. It was very evident from watching the FBI in 2 lengthy interviews that ran on WTKR that they were extremely upset about this and really pretty mortified. And it occurred to me, and I'll be upfront about this, it occurred to me that there's no organization more obsessed with its image than the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And hopefully I'll get a smile out of Jim when I say that.
Well, I mean, they are certainly concerned about their image. And
as they should be.
Yeah, I mean, and it started, I'm sure, with J. Edgar Hoover. He had some image issues himself, but the fact is that it's because you become less effective when people don't respect the organization. But I will also say that, I don't care how much they said they were publicly embarrassed. I mean, the guy who actually prepared those slides or that presentation was dead, and he had lost control of it, maybe through no fault of his own. But we don't know exactly how it got to the point where other people saw it. But as far as I know, they have never been published, those images. So I don't know that they weren't.
I know people that have copies of them who are not in law enforcement.
But all right, but who are those people? Well, you don't want to tell me. But all right, but how did they get a copy of it? I mean, did they take it from somebody who was in law enforcement, or did they take it from somebody who wasn't in law enforcement?
Well, they were circulated outside law enforcement circles.
Okay, to family members, perhaps, who got access to information because they were family members?
Perhaps.
Okay, well, then, you can't blame the FBI, because the FBI cannot control what people do outside of the FBI.
Well, Jim, I'm going to tell you I can blame the FBI, and I do.
Okay.
And the FBI's photographer lost control of these photographs. They should have never been used in the way that they were. This was a private, for-profit training academy who trained security guards and was not affiliated with any law enforcement agency. Look, I've talked to people in law enforcement that told me they attended conferences, which I know you do, and they talk about cold cases and other important things. And this discussion is valuable, and it's used for training. And I get it. There, people told me from different agencies. Oh, I remember sitting through a presentation about the Colonial Parkway murders, and I probably sat through that presentation. I don't have a problem with it. But what I'm saying is these moved outside law enforcement circles, and they moved out beyond the FBI's control. And it is the fault of that photographer, who was probably one of the photographers who maybe even shot some of the original work. But my point is, I began strongly criticizing the unfortunate fact that this had happened, and I've been upfront about this. I thought, and I said out loud, we can leverage the FBI's embarrassment about the crime scene photos to get them to do something about this cold case, which at that point was 23 years old. And an FBI agent admitted to me, he said, your sister's case is at the bottom of a very dusty pile. That's what he said. And I appreciated the honesty. I'm not saying I liked the hearing it, but it was an honest answer. But what I did is I began a significant localized media campaign. I did interviews. I coached the other family members. And quite frankly, we hammered pretty hard on the fact that we were very upset about this. Ultimately, I moved past my shock and disappointment and what have you about the photographs. I want somebody to tell me who killed my kid's sister, and that's what I steered the conversation back
I'm damn sure that the FBI would love to be able to be the people that tell you about that.
Sure, and they put resources back into the case as a result of all this media attention.
So, and that happens sometimes, but it's unfortunate. But the fact is that since 9/11, certainly, the FBI has significantly reduced the budgets for criminal squads and for behavioral analysis units that work criminal cases, and that is just a reality because the nation's priority is safety for the nation first, and then individuals later. The FBI has to sort of be the tip of the spear of that because that's what they do. They are a federal agency, and they're responsible for counterterrorism as well as counterespionage and criminal. But the money has been taken from us by Congress and put into terror. The criminal squads just don't have the same funding anymore. And we were, as criminal agents, we were very disappointed when the FBI stepped back from criminal investigations, active criminal investigations, not just cold cases. And unfortunately, Congress has never refunded those programs to the extent they were before 9/11. And to the extent that you can help us get the word out that Congress needs to do that, because it's not just enough for the FBI to look at the big picture, because there are a lot of cases like this that are unsolved that will remain unsolved because local jurisdictions don't have anywhere near the resources that the FBI used to have and aim at these kinds of serial cases.
But what surprises me is that not only were they not listening to the family's outcry, but the community at that time, they must have been going crazy that there's a serial killer killing couples. I mean, wasn't there a community outcry around Virginia that wanted this solved too, that were clamoring for somebody to do something? Well,
there certainly was at that time, Lisa, but one of the very frustrating things is, I've never lived in Virginia. I've never lived in this area. So,
I have.
To a certain extent, I'm an outsider.
Sure.
As I mentioned, I'll be there next week to do interviews in anticipation of the 30th anniversary. When I talk to a lot of people in Virginia, they oddly assume that the Colonial Parkway murders were solved decades ago. Or they'll say, well, didn't so-and-so commit those murders, because different suspects have risen to the level of media attention, and I think sometimes that average citizens have this expectation that, of course, all these cases get solved. And by the way, I appreciate what you said, Jim, just a moment ago. I'll go before Congress to, next week if you want me to, and I'll testify that I am 100% confident that one of the reasons why the Colonial Parkway murders have not been solved is because the FBI is understaffed and underfunded. And if we put some more money into this, into the FBI, we would have a lot more solved cases. At the same time, I'm ashamed as an American citizen that we have potentially hundreds of thousands of untested rape kits sitting on law enforcement shelves across the country. You can't tell me that there isn't a chance that the Colonial Parkway murders couldn't be related to some other unsolved case. And I would take great pride in providing. I'm not a big believer in closure, but any kind of relief to a family member of someone that had suffered a sexual assault or a murder or what have you. But, I think I'll get a little bit on my soapbox here. I think we as a country, our priorities are completely out of whack. If we put not even a gigantic amount of money, but, probably in the tens of millions of dollars back into some of these areas,
I've got to say, I agree with everything you say, Bill, and it's not just local to the US. I mean, it's the same in the UK too. And, with all the CT, the counterterrorism, kind of priorities, it meant that public protection became,
way down
a
in
really
priority,
low
sure.
priority. And all the advances that had been made in terms of strategy and training and joining things up all got sort of thrown out the window.
Sure,
And that's
I'm
really
sorry.
where, what my role has always been about is joining up intelligence and information and best practice and trying to get into intervention and prevention. But a lot of that just goes out the window when, a terrorist act happens. But some of it also is about missed opportunities and sloppy policing, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm.
And, we can keep dancing around saying the FBI are the best in the world and New Scotland Yard are the best in the world. But actually, a lot of times things are missed. And, sometimes it's human error. Sometimes it's people just being lazy and not doing their job. Sometimes it's resources, sure. But
And sometimes it's a perfect storm. And some
It
of
can
these
be.
offenders are very effective. I mean, if they are intelligent and criminally sophisticated or forensically sophisticated, they can get away with murder, and they do it many times. I mean, if you want to see unsolved homicide cases, why don't you look at the highway serial murder database
yes.
and look at the 600 plus cases. I don't know if it's still at 600, but there have been hundreds of cases of unsolved murders basically because the victimology is so high risk. Typically, these are either prostitutes or drug addicts or runaways.
the
or
less
people
dead in
hitchhiking.
inverted commas, the
Yes.
people that others don't really care about.
Right.
And
And-
there are many hundreds of these across the country. And again, the agency that's supposed to be doing these interstate cases, these serial murder cases, is not getting anywhere near the funding for criminal cases that it used to pre 9/11. And I'm not taking away the need for there to be funding for counterterrorism. The FBI and its partnerships at the Counterterrorism Center have prevented a number of homegrown and international terror events in the United States because of the money and resources and intelligence that have been put into it since then. So we are a safer country as a result of that. And I know, Laura, you've talked about how much safer the UK is being part of the European Union, because that actually helps.
From the law enforcement perspective,
Yes, that's what I was talking about. Yeah, and that is something that we're losing. You're going to be losing because Britain is exiting from the European Union, and one of the things that we lost in the United States because funding got so drastically cut.
Well, I agree with everything you're both saying. My point is, and I'm not losing sight of the fact that we're talking about a 30-year-old cold case. But one of the things I said to you, Jim, at the break was, we've gone back and we're retesting a lot of evidence now, and in some cases testing for the first time. Remember, the state of the art in 1986 is radically different than it is in 2016. And since the FBI put resources back into the case, but one of the things that's been very clear, no one ever says it flat out, but they'll send in small lots of evidence from the Colonial Parkway murders, from the various aspects of the case, and it seems like that we move along with glacial speed at times, and part of that, I am confident, is because of the budgets. And again, I recognize I'm passionate about trying to solve the Colonial Parkway murders because it's important to my family, but we end up moving very slowly because of budget reasons. I think in the richest country in the world that we can afford to have a very strong counterterrorism effort and quite successful. And, I lived in New York on 9/11 and lost friends on 9/11, and I don't want to see anything terrible happen to our country and the wonderful people who live here. But I think we can have both. I think we can find the money to put back into criminal investigations at the FBI, and that doesn't preclude counterterrorism and all the great work that the Bureau is doing in that regard in terms of keeping the country safe.
Right. I wonder if we could maybe start a GoFundMe campaign to get the DNA evidence in this case tested by a private lab or something to get this moving forward, because 30 years is a long time to wait for an answer for your family and these other families. And I just feel terrible that there's still so many questions out there. But there are a number of types of DNA evidence that I started to list some of the things that should be tested again, because STR is so much more sensitive, and you can develop so many more actual usable profiles, DNA profiles based on it, that all the evidence from this case should be retested. They should be doing swabs of the sweatshirts and the bindings and anything else that was left at all at the scene, and hopefully they'll be able to get more usable DNA information and maybe
the hair as well.
Yeah.
The mitochondrial, but I know that has been looked at before. But
What's STR?
It's a new. It's just a new type of DNA where they replicate the whatever alleles they find. They can multiply them from a very tiny sample into a usable sample size, and can read much more of the markers than they used to be able to do. So it's new technology, and it's always going to be moving
it's always
forward.
going to keep advancing.
Yeah.
And I can hear your frustration. I've certainly worked with families who have been equally frustrated, and you want to have the answer as to what happened and who did it. And I certainly, just from some of the behavioural analysis, I mean, it sounds in some senses, just with Kathy, the fact she was almost decapitated, I mean, it just strikes me as being somewhat, she either fought more and therefore there was further force used with her, or maybe this was something that was personal. For her to be the one that was subjected to such violence in that respect is an interesting thing.
That's entirely possible. It could be either or both of those things, but it does seem to be there's a very high level of violence directed towards Kathy as well. And again, in some of the other cases, because the evidence is not as well preserved, the experts have said to me, the first case is the most evidence rich of the four cases. But in one example we have badly decomposed bodies, in another one they've been in the water, in another one we have none at all.
But it tells us behaviorally that if it's the same person that did it, he or she they learned from their first experience, and that is normal in this kind of a situation.
And we see that in lots of series. I mean, I was just thinking as you were talking about the Dennis Rader case, Bind, Torture, Kill, who started out doing one thing and then learned very clearly throughout his offending career what was efficient and effective. And certainly when he first went into a house where there were 4 people, he did try and control all 4 people, but he also tried to manually strangle them. He tied them up and tried to manually strangle them, and realised actually it took quite a lot of physical strength when they were non-compliant. And he then put a bag over their head and tried to asphyxiate them, and it just took a lot more time and effort from what he thought to the actual act. So the next offence, he takes a gun with him. So, we do know this there's lots of other cases I could talk about where things do change as they learn and move on. But I do think there are some differences in the victimologies here, the victim selection. And we have to think about, were these, which cases are linked? Were they premeditated? Was there stalking, or was this something that was more about, the location, the place, and the people that it attracted?
Well, this sounds like a good time to take a break to hear a word from our sponsors. Hello, it's Jim Clementi and Francie Hakes with a special message about a new show that I'm hosting on Wondery called Locked Up Abroad. In each episode, people tell their harrowing stories of being convicted of crimes and jailed in foreign lands, or kidnapped and held hostage in war-torn countries.
These are definitely worst-case scenarios. They're truly frightening situations.
Yes, no best cases here.
But it is fascinating to hear how they manage to survive these ordeals.
In the first episode, Midnight Express, Billy Hayes tells us about being imprisoned in Turkey for smuggling hashish. Oliver Stone even made a movie about it. But that was the movie. This is the real story. I even had the chance to interview Billy Hayes recently, and he told me the whole story behind the story of how he escaped a Turkish prison. He even told me that he went back to Turkey years later. You have to hear his story to believe it.
And now, in his own words, here is Billy Hayes.
And now we're back from the break and back into the case. Why don't we now, Bill, move into the area of the crime scene? Can you tell us a little bit about how this whole crime was discovered? How law enforcement came upon it, what they found? What are the circumstances involved in this crime?
Sure. We're moving back to October 1986. It's a Sunday afternoon, October 12th. The law enforcement received a call that a white Honda Civic appears to have gone off an embankment from this grassy area along the Colonial Parkway.
So that embankment went down to the York River?
To the surface of the water. It's originally called in as what they think is a traffic accident. In other words, someone's accidentally rolled the car off this grassy area.
So it was actually caught in trees and bushes and
Yeah,
brambles.
kind of underbrush, yeah.
So it may have been the intention of whoever sent it down that hill to actually send it into the river.
It would appear so. It appears to have been pushed over the edge. The car is a 5-speed manual transmission, so the car is in neutral. Emergency brake is off, and they seem to have pushed it over the edge.
So what did the first responding officer find?
The first responder is a National Park Service ranger, and he comes upon the car and looks down and thinks that he looks through the back window. He can see 2 people inside, my sister and her girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski. They're not moving. He doesn't realize at this point he's dealing with a murder scene. He's still, I think, in the mindset that he's dealing with a traffic accident. He cannot open the 2 doors of the car because they're down in the brambles caught. So he can't get the doors open. He makes a decision, unfortunate in retrospect, to smash the back window, the very large hatchback window of the car in order to gain access. Unfortunately, a lot of evidence may have been shattered into 1,000 pieces at that moment. But again, he was doing the best he could. He shattered the back window, and then when he was able to stick his head in and see, my sister was in the hatchback area, and Becky's body was in the back seat with her feet extending over towards the passenger side. But once he realized that he wasn't dealing with a traffic accident, he was dealing with a crime scene, which has now been, unfortunately, rather seriously compromised. He, stepped back and called for backup or whatever it is that he would do.
And just to be fair, his first response was an emergency response,
Correct.
Which is what he did for a living, right? I mean,
right.
He would normally have responded, since he worked on the parkway, to accidents probably on
And
a
he's
regular
probably
basis.
thinking they're still alive,
Right.
and
Sure.
his
Hoping to
first
save
immediate
life.
response is to try and save lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And so no criticism intended. But
But it's unfortunate that it also most likely destroyed potential forensic evidence that could have helped.
What
Right.
kind of evidence, like fingerprints on the windshield?
Sure,
or
and
what?
and back in the day, they would just be fingerprints, but today those same fingerprints would have yielded DNA as well, because most fingerprints are left with sort of the oils from your fingers, and those can contain cells that have been sloughed off your body, and when you scratch your head or you wipe your face or you touch anywhere else on your body, you're picking up other cells, and they can be left inside a fingerprint. And now, with today's technology, you can actually run a good sample and get positive markers, enough markers to actually enter that into CODIS.
But of course, that can be a little misleading as well, as we well know in cases that
Yeah.
just because that print is there, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the killer.
Or because
Killers.
you can't necessarily date a fingerprint or DNA. There are circumstances in which you can, because if a material is produced on today and there's a fingerprint on it, let's say you just manufacture a plastic package and it just comes out of the machine and then it's put into another package and somebody opens it and then touches it and they leave their print there. Well, you know when it was manufactured, so you know the print was left after that date. But you don't know if it's the person who helped put it in the package or somebody who opened the package. So there are things that you still have to drill down into, circumstances you have to discover before you give a significant weight to particular DNA or fingerprint evidence.
eventually the car is towed back up onto the flat surface where they believe the car started. And at that point, first responders are able to get into the vehicle. I've actually talked to the first responders who recall, getting in and taking a look at the condition of Kathy and Becky's bodies. It became an FBI case because the Colonial Parkway where the car was found was federal property, and so the FBI. I don't think the FBI might necessarily have been on scene until Monday, but certainly I've talked to a number of people from law enforcement that were there on Sunday afternoon and Sunday evening.
So the National Park Service, though, would be the primary first responders. So the FBI not being there is probably normal procedure because they do have an investigative body within the National Park Service. Most likely they called the FBI in because it appeared to be, well, it's a double homicide and appeared to be potentially the beginning of a serial murder case. This looked like a very planned and targeted and carefully executed crime, at least up to a point. So let's go back into what they found when they opened up the vehicle.
Well, what they found was that Kathy and Becky had both been strangled with rope, their necks cut from, it's been described as beyond ear to ear. One of the first responders I recall telling me that when he was working on Kathy's body, when he moved the body, her head rocked back and he could see straight down her windpipe. So she was essentially decapitated. There were ligature marks on their wrists, and there was this attempt made to set the car on fire with diesel fuel. There were matches and cigarettes up at the top of the embankment, and it appears that there may have been an attempt to set the car on fire at that
Did
point.
your sister smoke as well? Were they?
No, and that was actually when the case was kind of reactivated in early 2010. One of the very first questions they called me with was, "Did your sister smoke?" And I said, "Cigarettes," and of course they laughed. And both my sister Kathy and her girlfriend Rebecca were both big athletes and took very good care of themselves and had never smoked.
But there was either kerosene or diesel fuel sort of poured over the victims in the car.
Correct, which made quite a mess, as I understand it.
And the question is whether that's a forensic countermeasure to try to cover up any kind of forensic evidence that the offender or offenders might have left on the body, or whether there was an attempt to actually light it on fire. And the reason why they think it might have been an attempt to light it on fire was because there were matches
and cigarettes. Now, I'm told, by the way, that the ignition property of diesel fuel is fairly low, as we talked about last time. Whereas the flashpoint of gasoline is obviously much higher, and it'll catch with a match. Sometimes it'll catch even with a spark. I'm told that it is actually possible to set diesel fuel on fire in a situation like this with a newspaper torch. In other words, what you have to do is elevate the temperature of the diesel fuel to a place where it'll ignite. It'll be a smoky fire. It'll be very messy, but it will catch. And so, for example, if they had wanted to, they could have set a substantial newspaper torch alight and gotten that burning pretty well, and then placed that inside the car, and that might have been enough to create a temperature high enough.
Did they have access to newspaper? I mean,
Well,
why did you pick
interestingly,
that? Yeah.
interestingly, there were flyers for some sort of sailing event that were in the back seat of the car. And Kathy, my sister, was kind of a neatnik, so I'm not. It's possible they might have been hers, but I've been told that they might have been able to use something like that, those paper products that they found in the car, to set the car on fire. Jim, you're absolutely right, though. It might not be an attempt to set the car on fire, and certainly the experts have told me that the use of a petroleum product, whatever it was, definitely obscured a lot of detail, because they actually described that the two women had chemical burns on their bodies post-mortem from sitting in what was likely diesel fuel.
Right. Wouldn't the fire attract attention?
It might have.
But it depends what the goal of the offender was. If it's to destroy forensic evidence that they may have left behind, then fire is a great tool for them, especially inside a vehicle, which then would have a secondary explosion from the gasoline in that vehicle. It's usually very effective. This didn't happen in this case. And was that because they weren't capable of doing that? Did they not think? Did they panic and want to get out of there and just push the car down the hill? Those are things we're not sure about, but those are possibilities we have to consider.
Some of the experts have used the expression overkill. To me, I don't know, maybe they're talking to us like we're civilians, which we are, but in other words, that there's actually at least three methods of killing being used here. You've got the strangulation with the rope, then you've got the cutting of the throats, and then at least a potential attempt to set the car on fire. And
but I wouldn't at all put setting the car on fire as overkill. It's just that's not overkill, because it is not a method of killing at this point.
It's after the fact.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, I'm sorry to get so graphic here, but if you strangle somebody, asphyxiate them with a rope, they will probably be brain dead before their heart actually stops beating. And because of that, somebody who doesn't know what they're doing will think they have to do something else. It could also be a ritual aspect that the person, and I think based on your description of the piece of rope that's kind of pinned behind your sister's neck, I think that it's most likely that the rope was attached to her neck when this person used a knife to slit her throat. Mm-hmm. And that in that process, they cut the rope on both sides. And so it's very possible that was a ritualistic action on their part, something they really wanted to do. But it tells us something about the offender, that this offender doesn't mind what we call wet work and wanted to be up close and personal. It's very similar to what happened to Nicole Simpson. And in that case, it marked a very direct rage at this person. And I would say that it's a very high likelihood that there was rage directed at your sister. It may not have been a personal rage. It may have been what she represented to this person. But it could also have been a very personal rage directed at her as an individual.
Or it could be, the non-compliance aspect. She's the one that is fighting back. I mean, I've certainly seen in rape cases where there's a variance in physical violence. One particular case where she actually needed plastic surgery and her face rebuilt, and a rape just before that where he physically didn't violently attack her. He raped her, but he didn't physically assault her. And a lot of the police officers that I was working with felt they were two markedly different cases, but it was actually a lot more about the victim's reaction and then the offender's reaction to that. And, it could be either in this particular case, certainly with Nicole, she was almost decapitated too. I mean, probably from behind, but stabbed many, many times. And I think given that the victimology and, we talked a little bit about, your sister's kind of mindset, but also her physicality, that yes, on the one hand, she could have been following instructions if she thought this was someone who was an authority figure. But the minute she knows she's under threat and duress, or her partner's under threat or duress, is probably the time where she would fight back. Is that?
I think so. And remember, she's a Naval Academy graduate. They had taken martial arts training. I probably back then had 6 inches and 50 pounds on Kathy. She was, 5'6", 5'7", 135. She might have even, if she was working out, she might have been 145 pounds, but in very, very good shape. But I remember when she came home from the Naval Academy at some point, she was showing us what they were teaching them in terms of self-defense training. And it was quite serious. They were, training people to be in the military. And I think Kathy probably could have put up a good fight. And as we've talked about it, situations degenerate to the place where you realize bad things are going to happen here, or maybe they're already happening, and you're going to fight back. I could see Kathy doing that.
I mean, the question in my mind is, the trying to gain compliance with two, physically fit young women.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you may have the element of surprise, but it's still a very difficult thing to do, and if you're in a confined space.
Yeah. And agreed. And to Jim's point from a moment ago, one of the things that the FBI has told us is that their hearts were still beating when their throats were cut. So to Jim's point about, the strangulation followed by the throat cutting, I guess based on blood spatter and that sort of thing inside this car, I've always struggled with something, which is I just have a hard time picturing all of this terrible activity going down in a 1980 Honda Civic two-door.
Well, that was one of the questions that I had. I mean, and from what I believe to be the case was that they were actually killed outside the car and then stuffed back into the car.
That's my belief as well. But what's interesting is that that site where the car is found might not necessarily be the murder site. In other words, the killing could have taken place somewhere else.
Right.
And
for example, they could have stopped at another place. That's where they were first abducted, and then they were moved to this secondary location as a disposal site. We just don't know.
Right.
But
and then, of course, you have to figure, the moving around of the cars. In other words, is Kathy driving this car at some point? I'm sure Kathy, it was her car, and she loved to drive. I'm sure she was at least operating the vehicle when this whole thing started. But then, you've got this idea of moving cars around and ultimately pushing the car over the edge. There's some logistics involved here, either before or after the murders that you sort of have to sort out.
mm-hmm.
And they didn't sustain any other blows to the head, like in the...
Not that I'm
Nicole and
aware
Al's
of.
case.
The autopsy report that they give the families, which of course I have a copy of, is not as detailed as the one that would be shared with the medical and law enforcement people.
So, assuming then that there were no additional injuries, to me, and I want to get your opinion on this too, Laura, to me that would indicate that the offender probably, if it's one offender, had a gun in addition to a knife, in order to control two people at the same time in a vehicle. Otherwise, it would be extremely difficult to do that unless through the appearance of being an authority figure, they both submitted to being handcuffed and therefore able to protect themselves before anything else went down. And there's no indicators of that, but the fact is that something like a gun could be used to control two people at once, and especially because they care about each other, by making a threat to one person, they could have controlled the other as well. And I suppose that could be done with a knife.
Right. I mean, a gun, or possibly, you've got multiple offenders here.
It's possible.
Both are possible. And I think, some of it depends on which cases you think are linked, what's motivating this crime.
Starting at this point, though, I'm thinking about that. I mean, I tell you, if there was sexual assault, I would be more likely to believe that there could have been multiple offenders. But the fact that there is no sexual assault, no evidence of sexual assault, I don't know. I'm not seeing, the only indicator that might indicate multiple offenders is the fact that you have two people to control, right? There's that. And then plus the rope, strangulation, and then the knife. Sometimes when you see multiple causes of death, multiple weapons that are utilized in a murder, that could be that there are two people involved. But the fact that they both suffer the same two injuries, right? The strangulation and then the slitting of the throat.
Although Rebecca not to such an extent.
Right. But it just tells me that it's not two different people doing two different things. And it may not be as much overkill as it is ritualistic behavior. Although, if you told me that they were stabbed 67 times, I would call that overkill.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't even have to be two different types to be overkill. But strangulation could be how he got them to a point where they were not conscious. And
Right.
then did, the
Once
final
they
thing
were
that killed them.
restrained.
Right.
I mean, they were restrained with their wrists and their legs as well, or just their wrists?
I'm answering this off the top of my head, Laura, but I think it's the wrists. I don't recall a mention of ankles or feet, anything like that.
So they would have had to be incapacitated to a degree, or the threat of something much greater.
Right. Yeah, definitely. There's a couple other forensic things I want to hit on, and then I think we'll take a break and come back. But one was that there was hair found in Kathy's hand, right?
Correct.
And what do we know about that hair? Have they told you anything about the quality of that hair? Was it pulled out? Was it broken?
They haven't said very much. More recently, they've been looking at hair. They haven't necessarily said it was from Kathy's hand, but I know that they're looking at hair from inside the car.
But it wasn't Kathy's, or it wasn't Rebecca's.
Well, they've never said that definitively.
Right.
I know there's some concern about some of the tests that they want to conduct, that the hair will be destroyed in the process. You would know more about that than I would. But there's been a little bit of a go slow attitude in that regard, because they wanted to be careful that they didn't destroy all of the hair evidence that they had.
That makes sense.
Well, one of the other things that was also found was orange carpet fibers on your sister's body, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. And when the FBI agent came to the house, a house that Kathy had shared with her first girlfriend and a couple of other women, I know they were looking for orange carpet fibers.
Right. Well, I know that. I mean, just so happens, I believe it was also in the Atlanta child murders case where Wayne Williams killed a number of young people in around Atlanta. That there were carpet fibers from inside the car, and orange is a fiber that's in industrial carpets mainly, and it's used in different types of carpets that you might find in the back of a car. It clearly wasn't from your sister's car, otherwise it wouldn't have stood out. But that's just one thing I think everybody and our listeners should probably keep in mind. And there are also about 150 partial prints lifted from the car. So despite the fact that there was apparent forensic countermeasures in terms of spreading some kind of fuel oil on the bodies, they still were able to recover 150 partial prints, and they may be, I'm sure a number of those, because the car was 6 years old at the time, were from normal use, but some of them could have been from the offender.
So this seems like a good time to take a break. So here's a word from our sponsors. So now we're back and we're continuing our conversation.
So anything else forensically that you remember from the actual crime scene?
No, I think that covers the most important elements.
They were both fully clothed.
They were both fully clothed, and as we've talked about, there's no sign of rape or robbery.
No
Or
mud-
no sign of sexual assault at all?
No, none whatsoever.
And no mud on their clothes that might indicate that they were killed outside of the car and then shoved back.
Not that I've ever been told.
But it would be more the lack of arterial spurts and blood in the car. If there wasn't, in other words, if you create such an injury that happened to your sister and to Rebecca, then there's a certain amount of blood that you would expect to be in the car where they are. There wasn't a sufficient amount of blood in the car to cause it. You can have arterial spray on your body and bring it back in with you, but I'm not sure because I haven't seen those crime scene photos.
And I'm not sure that there seems to be some difference of opinion. Some of the experts, and we had face-to-face meetings with the FBI, some of them did not think there was sufficient amount of blood inside the car to indicate that the entire thing had transpired inside the Honda.
Well, it'd be very, very difficult to pull that crime off inside that car where the victims are. I mean, how would you be in there to do that to your sister stuffed in that little hatchback? It would be very
To me, it
small
doesn't
car,
make any
isn't it?
sense. But I have a hard time picturing all of these terrible things happening within the physical confines
Right.
of that 1980 Honda Civic.
Doesn't make sense. But two questions from me. One, was the glove box open, and was you mentioned her purse or her wallet, was that
I don't
found
think the
open?
glove box was open. My recollection is that her purse was there and it was open, and there's money in the wallet, and there is some sense that, and this shows up in a few of the other crime scenes, that someone might have been approached like by a law enforcement
But
officer.
do you know whether or not your sister kept the registration for her car in the glove box or in her purse?
I'm not sure. I'm going to completely guess, but my guess is in the glove box. I don't think she would have carried it in her purse.
Did she have her ID in her purse, or
She did. Now, again, I'm not sure. Every item that was in that purse, and I don't recall necessarily all of those things being returned to us.
right? But there was money in there.
But there was
recall.
money in there. I do remember certain things coming back to us, like her Naval Academy ring, that kind of thing,
Right.
which she was wearing at the time. Those things were returned to
So
us.
jewellery that she was wearing, money that they had, and personal possessions.
And that ring, was that gold?
Yes.
Okay,
So
it
those
was
things
worth money.
weren't taken, which
Right.
tells us a lot.
Yeah.
It's a trophy. It could be a possible trophy, too, to take.
If you took it, yes, but the fact that you didn't take it,
It's not what this offence is about.
right, there's some other goal.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is a lot of trouble to go through without any other specific motivation. I mean, I don't see anything other than the fact that this is a double homicide of two women that were together that we happen to know were in a lesbian relationship, and the goal was to control them and kill them in a very brutal way.
It certainly feels targeted. I
Yeah.
mean, we've got the what, but the where is a question mark, because it could have been somewhere else. The actual approach site where the attack happens to deposition. The when, the how. I mean, some of the logistics of that. That's a lot to manage for one person to manage. That's a lot. So thinking about other antecedents this person or persons might have, but certainly the why. It does strike me as a targeted attack. To get you to the who. It's that motivation of what is it that they are seeking.
And so by targeted, for me, that leaves only two possibilities. One is that there is a personal relationship or a very tangential relationship between the offender and your sister and or Rebecca, or who they were represented a class of people that they wanted to attack.
And it
so
could be a geographic
it could be
selection.
Yeah, it could be, and a number of serial killers will do that. They'll sort of weave their web, and whoever falls into it. But it would probably have to be that they became surrogates in that case. So, but it does not seem like a rape case that didn't come to fruition. It does not seem like a robbery gone bad. It does not seem like a drug deal gone bad. So we can rule out some pretty significant motives that we see repeatedly, and we're left with a potential hate crime, I believe, or a grudge, revenge kill that has a lot of anger and rage involved in it.
Certainly feels like anger and rage here.
Mm-hmm. To me, it seems very personal and very intimate. It's, in this example, you would likely be holding Kathy and Becky separately while you're killing them. In other words, the strangulation, the throat cutting, it's all very up close and personal. It seems very rage-filled.
It is. I mean, it is
to
wet
me.
work. It's, close contact. But remind me, Bill, what were they doing just before this? They were in a computer lab, and
there were two sets of friends. My sister's first girlfriend and another friend, and Kathy and Becky were all together at William and Mary working on an assignment. And two of the friends, Becky and my sister's first girlfriend, were taking a class together. And that following day, Friday, the assignment was due. And so the four friends were working on this assignment. And then sometime in the evening, Kathy and Becky spun off to get something to eat. And my understanding is your evening dining options in Williamsburg back in 1986 were kind of limited. So they went off campus somewhere to find something to eat that evening. So it's not until the next day when Becky's a no-show at the class where the assignment is due, and Kathy is a no-show at her stock brokerage where she's working in Virginia Beach. Now the other two friends, one would have expected Becky at class, and the fourth friend worked with Kathy at the stock brokerage, and so they both noticed that these two highly responsible, very buttoned up hard worker type A types are no-shows, one at school and one at work. Now, Kathy did have the kind of job where she would have had the flexibility to take a day off whenever she wanted. It was a 100% commission kind of job at the stock brokerage. And her friend Karen, who worked with her, said all she would have had to do was call in and say, hey, we're taking off early for the Columbus Day weekend. I won't be in until Tuesday. And there wouldn't have been any problem. And so for Kathy not to show up on Friday morning and for Becky not to show up at class, that sent up some low-level alarm bells. Now, I have to remind everybody, this is a pre-cell phone, pre-internet environment. So when your friends aren't around, you can't call them on the cell, you can't send them a text. None of these things exist.
Right.
So they kind of went into the weekend wondering whatever happened to them.
Because they weren't posting on social media either.
No, I can't say that they were.
Yeah. It's obvious that there's a ton of more information for us to go through, and we're not going to be able to get through it all today, but we will have you back, Bill, again to go through the details of the other murders that have been now known as Colonial Parkway murders, as well as the additional one in 1996 that Laura was talking about earlier. We really appreciate your time and all the details you're giving us, and we hope you'll come back so we can talk more about this case.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
Great.
Thank you, Bill. It's been incredible talking to you, and you're obviously, you've lived through this, you've been in the shoes of, but you've also become almost like a pseudo-expert on the detail, and the devil's always in the detail with these cases. So I certainly appreciate, as do the team, you talking us through it and sharing those details.
And I'm
Oh,
just
thank you.
it's so important that you keep fighting the fight, that you just are tirelessly moving forward, constantly trying to bring justice to not only your sister, but the rest of these victims.
Thank you.
We appreciate it, definitely. Well, thank you very much from those of us at Real Crime Profile. We'll be back again with Bill Thomas to talk more about this incredibly fascinating and disturbing case.
So if you like our show and you want to help us out, there are a couple things you can do. First, you can go over to iTunes and leave us a positive 5-star review. You can also like our Facebook page and join in on some great questions, comments, and conversations. We always love to hear from you there. You can follow us on Twitter. You can check out our sponsors. And most importantly, you can share us with friends, family, and anyone you know who's interested in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes. Thanks for listening.
For advice or support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0207 840 8960 or go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, shelter, safety or counselling, call the Genesis 24-hour hotline 214-946-4357 or go on the website www.genesisshelter.org, or you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline on 800 799 7233.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan, engineered by Jacob Moose Molin. Music is composed and performed by Simba Sumba. Logo art by Rob Cohen. Real Crime Profile is produced and recorded at Empire Studios LA by XG Productions. Real Crime Profile is distributed by Wondery.
Ooh.